So, or on one of the mics. So if they bring it back in, we'll let them mic it.
Yeah.
It is my honor and privilege to be here with you this evening and welcome our two guests. For those of you who do not know, Sarah Bagby from Watermark Books Cafe I've enjoyed being in her presence when she has interviewed people and she draws her own crowd in and of herself. So those she interviews are very fortunate to have that conversation with her. I assured the ladies, I am not going to take a great deal of time in introducing them because you want to hear from them, not about them. So our other guest then this evening would be, is it retired justice? Is that a former justice? Carol Beier. And I had the privilege of meeting her several years ago, back when this was kind of in the works again, back when there was discussion about how justices should be replaced, or should be, whether that needed to be revisited. So we were interested then, we're interested now. Her degrees, her years of service on the bench, and the program just go on and on. So I'm not going to leave with that. I'm going to turn it over to them. Do we have another mic? Yeah. All right. Okay, perfect. I will turn it over to them.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for being here because this is an important topic for us to hear about, and we are really privileged to have Carol here, spending her generous retired time helping us understand the issues around the Kansas Supreme Court. I want you to just start by telling us about your background and what led you to want to serve on the Supreme Court.
Great. I'm happy. I am a KCK girl. A little bit too soft still. How's that better? A little better. I'll speak out a little bit too. Sorry. I grew up in Kansas City, Kansas, with a couple of our distinguished guests this evening, and had no ambition to be a lawyer. As far as I knew at that time, didn't think I knew any lawyers. Wasn't aware of any lawyers in the vicinity. Just had no exposure at all to the law. It was early 70s, and Watergate was happening, and you all who are old enough to remember that know that the heroes in the story ended up being the investigative journalists who followed the money and told us all what was going on in our government. And that made a lot of impression on me, partly because I watched so much television.
Okay, hang on a second. Good, here we go. Better? Okay. So at any rate, it made a big impression on me because they were the heroes of the story. It also made an impression on me because I watched my father react to it. And to him, he's a World War II vet, really had been somebody who had moved through, being pretty impoverished, frankly, farm kid, had gone to college on the GI Bill. He managed to kind of make something of himself, as we say, in our culture. And he was so disappointed. He was just racked by watching crimes in our name, etc. It's very disappointing for him to watch. And so I developed an idea for university. So that's what I initially pursued. I started college at Benedictine, went there for about a year and a half, and then I changed over to KU where I got my journalism degree. And I did work in newspapers for a while, and I loved it. I loved the smell of the ink. I loved the smell of the paper. I loved deadline. I loved everything about the newspaper business. But after I've been doing it for a couple of years, I thought it would be a good idea to get kind of a general purpose graduate degree. I'm expecting Diana to laugh at me here. She had quite a bit more exposure to lawyers growing up than I did, and she knew that law school was professional school when she entered it, and then when you came out the other end, lo and behold, you were a lawyer. And that's what happened, of course, with me. And I had opportunities presented because of going to law school that were going to get me some of the places I wanted to go even faster than the journalism route. So I ended up clerking for a judge my first year out of school, federal judge. Then working in DC for a couple of years. I was a fellow at Georgetown, and I worked at the National Women's Law Center for a year on a fellowship through Georgetown. And then I practiced on a private firm. And then I went back to Kansas. And in fact, moved here to Wichita. Got married and had a stepson there for a while, but I thought maybe the bench looked interesting. And I was appointed in 2000 to the Court of Appeals by Governor Graves, and then eventually the Kansas Supreme Court in 2003 by Governor Sebelius. And I served there until September of 2020. So 3.5 years in the Court of Appeals and then about 17 years on the Kansas Supreme Court. I was attracted to the bench primarily because I wanted to be a public servant. And I think that really kind of goes back to where I started. I saw most journalists as public servants, and I was attracted to public service because of the example of my parents. That's kind of the background.
So, so you've retired.
I have.
So what's the current makeup of the court? Yeah, and tell us about, maybe tell us a little bit about who they are and their backgrounds.
Sure. There are 7 members of the Kansas Supreme Court, and the most senior person on the court, and that's senior in numbers of years of service, not necessarily in age, is another woman, Marla Lugert. She's our Chief Justice now. She's been the Chief Justice for the last 3 years. She came to the court in 2002 by way of the Shawnee County District Bench, Shawnee County being Topeka, of course. And she to Goodland, outside of Goodland, that's where she went her legal career in Topeka. She went to Washington Law School, and then she practiced law for a number of years there and was on the trial court bench, and then eventually went to the Supreme Court. She is extraordinarily capable, really otherworldly capable, and charming to boot. And if you have an opportunity, you may have an opportunity in coming months to see Marla come out and speak. I really recommend that you do it. I think you'll be wowed. I really do. So she's the most senior member of the current court. The second most senior member is Eric Rosen. He is a Topeka boy and has lived there all of his life. He also served on the trial court bench before coming to the Supreme Court. He is the only one of the 7 members of the current court who will not be on this year's retention ballot, which is a general election issue. And we'll talk more about that later, but Eric is the only one of these 7 I'm describing who will not be on the ballot this year. The third most senior member is a gentleman by the name of Dan Biles. He grew up in El Dorado, and he practiced all of his legal career in private practice in the Johnson County area. He did a lot of government practice, and he was also a journalist before he went to law school. So Dan and I had that in common. The fourth most senior member of the court is Caleb Stiegel. Oh, I should have mentioned Marla was also appointed by Governor Graves, and then Eric and Dan both by Governor Sebelius. And then the fourth most senior member of the court is a gentleman by the name of Caleb Stiegel. He was appointed by Governor Brownback. Caleb grew up in Lawrence. He did practice for a time in Wichita, and then he left his Wichita large firm practice, started his own very small firm, and was county attorney up in Jefferson County around Lawrence. He's been on the court since, double check, 2014, so that's when he was appointed. The next most senior member, the next 3 members of the court were all appointed in 2020 by Governor Laura Kelly. She's had 3 vacancies to fill since her term began. First of all, our colleague Lee Johnson retired, and he was replaced by Evelyn Wilson. Evelyn grew up in Smith Center, small town Kansas, just double checking my notes, make sure I get it right. We have several small town folks on our court right now. She grew up in Smith Center, and she also went to Washington Law School, practiced for a while in a very small town, but then in Topeka. Quite a long time. She had about 20 years, I think, in practice before she joined the district bench and then the Supreme Court. Then we also have KJ Wall, who was also appointed, as I mentioned, by Kelly in 2020. KJ practiced, he was in the insurance industry for a while. He had a federal court clerkship. That's usually a sign of doing really well in law school. And then he practiced in the insurance industry for a while. He practiced at the court for a while as our special projects director. During my tenure, he was working for us for a while. And then he went back out into private practice, and he was appointed by Governor Kelly 2 years ago as a replacement for Chief Justice Lawton Nuss. He was our immediate past chief. And then finally, the woman appointed to replace me when I retired is Melissa Taylor Standridge. She grew up in the Johnson County and Lawrence areas. Her parents lived both places as she was growing up. She is fascinating for a lot of reasons, but one of the things I like to do when I go out and speak with Melissa, she talks about her first job out of college. She was a buyer for Macy's. And especially when you all remember Macy's? I mean, they're not around much anymore, but she used to buy clothes for Macy's, and it's great when we go talk to teenagers because she said, I used to have a $5 million clothing budget. But she's really funny and super smart, and she was in private practice for a while, and then she worked in the court system. And so Melissa's the 7th in seniority now.
So the cumulative years of experience on this bench is amazing, yeah. And in every type of experience that an attorney can have. Private practice, insurance, federal bench, all that. It's great.
It's very broad, and cumulative is,
That's a great point. I hadn't thought about it really, and I would have added it up to be very specific, but the top 3 or 4 folks have been practicing law for nearly 40 years. I mean, been in the law business for nearly 40 years each. So you have that, plus the 4 less senior members, but even they have, Melissa, for example, has very broad and deep experience. Caleb has practiced in criminal law as well as civil practice. It's very important because the cases that come to the court are severe.
So, okay, you kind of went, how long do they serve? And they're selected, and what's the selection process?
Great. Well, Kansas has kind of an assortment of selection processes for its bench. So I want to review a little bit about that, but I'll tell you about our court first, about the Kansas Supreme Court. I mentioned who appointed each of these justices, just for interest's sake. I thought you might be interested. That also is varied, and it stretches clear back to the greatest administration. The way that the system works for the Kansas Supreme Court, and this is ordained by Kansas constitutional law. So this is the way it works under the Kansas Constitution. The court's established by the Constitution, the People's Document, and it's people are appointed to the court the same way. So the Constitution dictates that there's a Supreme Court nominating commission, and that nominating commission is made up of 9 people. There's a lot of misinformation out there about this, so I want to be very clear about the way it works. There are 4 members of the Supreme Court Nominating Commission who are appointed by the sitting governor. But those 4 members are appointed one at a time over a span of 4 years. So if you're a governor who comes into office, you're only going to have 1 appointment to the nominating commission in your first year, second year, the second, third, and so on. So those 4 lay members arrive at the nominating commission that way. The other 5 members are lawyers, and this is how they get there. We have 4 congressional districts in Kansas. So in each congressional district, all of the people who are active practitioners in Kansas are permitted to vote, active law practitioners, so law-trained people are permitted to vote on the lawyer from among their number who will represent that district on the nominating commission. Those elections also are staggered. So again, it takes 4 years for the full group of the 4 members from the congressional districts to potentially change. So it's designed to be a gradual kind of deliberative process. And you can check out their performance because their meetings are public. You can watch the person who's from your area. You can have input on who that person is. The 5th lawyer, who serves as the chair of the commission, arrives at their seat also through an election of members of the bar, lawyers, but it's statewide. So that person has to have enough experience, respect, to garner enough votes statewide of lawyers in order to serve on the nominating commission. That nominating commission, that's all the candidates. So if there's a vacancy, if I'm practicing law and I think I might like to be on the Kansas Supreme Court, I submit my name for consideration. That involves an enormous amount of effort, just the submission, in terms of gathering all the evidence of what you've done in your career, why you might be qualified. The commission vets all those applications, interviews all those clients at public meetings that you're able to watch, able to attend. The press is all, of course, able to attend and watch. And then they select 3 names to go to the governor. And the governor appoints from that number. So that's the way it works for the Kansas Supreme Court. That's the way it worked for many, many years for the Kansas Court of Appeals as well, which is our intermediate appellate court. But the Court of Appeals, the Kansas Court of Appeals, is a creation of statute instead of a creature of the Constitution. And because of that, it was possible for the legislature to vote and change the method of selection for the Kansas Court of Appeals. And that's in fact what happened about 10 years ago, roughly. About 10 years ago, the Kansas legislature decided that what they wanted to do for the Court of Appeals process instead was that the governor could appoint anyone the governor chose. There was no outside or independent vetting anymore that was necessary. The governor could choose to use a method that did that, and in fact, our current governor does, but it's not necessary anymore. I refer to it a little bit jaded perhaps, but as the federal model light. We've all kind of seen the way things work for the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, the president just chooses someone, right? And then there's Senate confirmation. That's the way it works now in Kansas for the Kansas Court of Appeals. The governor selects, and then the person who is nominated is subjected to Senate confirmation. The reason I say light is that in Kansas, the terms are limited. So for the federal bench, once you're on the federal bench, you have a lifetime term for good behavior. It's very, very rare for a federal judge to be ousted from office for anything that is described as something less than good behavior. So that's not the way it works in Kansas. In Kansas, Supreme Court justices have 6-year terms. Court of Appeals judges have 4-year terms. And then our district courts are a combination of appointment system, like I described for the Kansas Supreme Court, or partisan election, regular partisan election, which is like an election all of us recognize. You identify as a Democrat or Republican or an independent, you have yard signs, you have kind of a typical partisan election. And that's the way our districts choose their judges. Approximately half of the districts in Kansas, there are 31 judicial districts in Kansas. Sedgwick County is its own district because it's so populated. Half of our districts have decided at some point in their history that they want to be partisan election districts. That's what Sedgwick County has. And half of them have chosen the other method that more mirrors the Kansas Supreme Court nominating commission's kind of set up. So that's how it works. And the district judges, the trial bench is 4 years like the Court of Appeals.
Okay, so the election, so you have a 6-year term, and then what?
In order to remain in office, the Kansas Supreme Court justices are submitted to retention election. And I mentioned a few moments ago that 6 of the 7 justices will be on the ballot this coming November. that is just a function of when they arrived and how their terms fall. Remember I mentioned that the three senior members of the court have only been on the court since 2020. The way that retention elections are set up, each justice must sit for retention in the first general election after the justice has served for 1 year. Well, each of the three people who are the senior on the court has been on the court for longer than a year. Not 6 years, mind you, but they've been longer than a year. So they must sit on the retention ballot this year. Then it's every 6 years. So the three more senior people who are on the ballot, Chief Justice Lubert, Justice Biles, Justice Stiebel, they are sitting having been retained in 2016. And for Marla and Dan before that as well. First retention election for Caleb was 2016. So those three have been through this process before, but the three new members of the court are going through it for the first time because they're outside a year of service.
And but they have been vetted by this extensive panel that is put together.
Oh, sure.
I forgot this. I want to just explain real basic, the difference between a retention election. I mentioned that half of our districts have regular partisan elections, so we all recognize from every other election we've ever voted in. Retention election is different. There's no opponent. There's just yes or no. So the way the question is worded on the ballot, it just said, for example, when I was on the court, it would say, should Carol A. Beier be retained in office? And there'd be a label, Kansas Supreme Court, and then whoever was on the ballot, their name gets listed in exactly that fashion. So your job as a voter is just say yes, if you're satisfied with the performance of the justice, or no, if you're not, for whatever reason. And so it's the way that you prevail in a retention election is to have 50% of the voting that day, plus one. You have to have over 50% in order to be retained in office.
Okay, before we get to the way the cases are selected, what they mean to us as we read the headlines and that kind of thing, I just want to ask one quick question. Well, it may not be quick, but I want to ask.
Listen to me, so you don't have time to be quick.
So I wonder, I mean, the members of the court have more responsibilities than just sitting at the bench hearing cases. Can you kind of describe, I mean, I'm assuming there's a hierarchy there of justices throughout the state, and what does that look like?
Sarah's right. When I was on the Court of Appeals, as a Court of Appeals judge, I used to write at least 10 opinions a month. And pretty much that was my whole job. You know, I read briefs, I heard oral argument. We had a lot of summary calendar cases that didn't get oral argument, and I was expected to make sure I was turning out 10 opinions a month. Hard case, not so hard case, it didn't matter, 10 opinions a month. And we'd sit there on the second floor of the judicial center, it's a 3-story building, and we'd look upstairs and go, what do they do all day? You know, as underlings tend to do, right? But the thing was, once I got to the Kansas Supreme Court, I realized, oh, they do all that too. So the Kansas Supreme Court has fewer total opinions every year than the Kansas Court of Appeals by far. There are 14 judges on the Court of Appeals, that's one of the reasons. But they do all of the administration for the entire Kansas court system as well. So the way I always describe it is the Chief Justice is sort of like the chair of the board of directors of the Kansas judiciary. And the Kansas judiciary, remember I mentioned there are 31 judicial districts. Some of those judicial districts have in excess of 20 judges, 25 judges, as Sedgwick County does, but some of them just have one. But every district has multiple courthouses. The grand total for the state is about 250, 275 judges, plus about 1,600 or more non-judicial employees. So if you just think about it, you know, business of any kind, an enterprise of any kind, when you have that kind of person power that are performing all the duties of the organization, that's complicated, and just the HR function alone is a complicated function. But the court also runs all the ethics systems for lawyers, all the admission systems for lawyers, runs all the clerk's offices, all those people that you might come in contact with when when you have courthouse business, all of those people work under the supervision of the Kansas Supreme Court. So there are lots and lots of administrative duties that also go with the office. Some of them have to do with your department. When I was on the court, I had a department of 6 districts kind of in this part of the state. So Sedgwick County was one of my districts. Every time a judge needed selecting because there was a vacancy, every time there was a personnel problem in my districts, et cetera, I would be the person on point to deal with that. And each of the associate justices have those kinds of responsibilities. The chief, on top of that, has a whole several people more worth of work to do just in administering the court systems. That's a pretty important part of the job as well.
And we have a very capable chief right now, or CEO, or however you want to put it. So good. Okay, so we hear and we read about courts dealing with various issues locally, nationally, federally, statewide. It can be a bit confusing. Can you just kind of sum that up?
I've mentioned that I worked for a federal judge right out of law school, and that KJ Wall also did. It's important, I guess, if you can kind of keep these categories in mind. Much of what you read in the newspaper, those of us lucky enough to be able to still read a newspaper or online or whatever, much of what you read in terms of news coverage of the court system is about the federal court system. I mean, we all read a lot about the US Supreme Court, right? And we read some about the intermediate levels of federal appeal, right? So there's an entire federal system that has trial courts, which they also refer to as district courts, and then a court of appeals with various districts all over the United States, and then the US Supreme Court. So that's one whole set of the judiciary. The judiciary, the Kansas judiciary, and every state judiciary is another whole layer of judicial system. And again, we have trial bench, court of appeals, and then the Supreme Court. But they're different systems with different people in charge and a lot of different culture, I would say, and different ways of going about their decision-making. My court always sat on, we call it en banc, which means all 7 of us were on every single case together. The Court of Appeals sat in panels of 3. Those are similarities to the federal system, but they're 2 completely different systems. And then every municipality also has a judicial system. So in Kansas, we have hundreds of municipalities also have judicial systems. I'll just tell you one quick story. One of my colleagues on the Court of Appeals, who very recently retired, had the distinction, I think maybe being the only one in the Kansas system who had served at a municipal judge level and then at the trial bench for a number of years in Johnson County, and then at the Court of Appeals for many, many, many years. And he used to tell the story of being the municipal judge in a very tiny town in Johnson County, when Johnson County still had very tiny towns. And he said that he used to have court maybe once a month, you know, traffic infractions, other kinds of, you know, littering, sorts of municipal offenses. And he said the biggest challenge of that job, which was court in a little strip mall in this little tiny town, was to be heard over the tennis shoes going around in the dryer next door at the laundromat. Anyway, very charming. Anyway, so we have all these court systems, right? So I guess I would urge you, when you read a story about what some court has decided, whatever the issue is, you make sure to kind of keep that in mind. Which court system are we talking about here? And what's their jurisdiction? Because it varies depending on the system you're talking about.
Good. This has all been very informative. So now we have the groundwork. And what I want to know, what kind of cases go to the Supreme Court? How many of the ones that are presented to you do you choose? And how do you go about deciding? You all 7 sit for every one, and then what?
We'll take this in steps. So first of all, cases reach the Kansas Supreme Court. There's 3 different avenues to get there. Most of the docket are cases that have been decided in the trial court. Someone's not happy. They appeal to the Kansas Court of Appeals, They have 3-judge panel of the Kansas Court of Appeals. Typically, they rarely sit as a court of 14. A 3-judge panel makes a decision. They may rule in favor of the person who won below. They may rule in favor of the person taking the appeal because they were dissatisfied. So they rule. We've now had those 2 levels of decision-making. 1 trial judge, 3 Court of Appeals judges. The person who loses at the Court of Appeals, the person who's aggrieved, the person who's dissatisfied at the Court of Appeals level, has the option of filing what we call a petition for review. The Supreme Court gets hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of petitions for review every year. And it has discretion whether to take or not take those cases. So that category is discretionary review after filing of a petition for review by a party who's unhappy with what's happened below in the Court of Appeals. And they grant a fair number of them, but only a fraction of those filed. But that forms probably the bulk of the Kansas Supreme Court docket. There are certain types of those cases that culturally tradition has always urged the court to take. But generally speaking, they look at things like, is there a novel issue of law? If it's just a case that's going to be resolved by something that's well settled in the law, this statute says this is how we interpret it, it was applied correctly, end of story. If it's something that looks pretty straightforward, that case is less likely to be granted discretionary review for obvious reasons. The Court of Appeals is bound by Supreme Court precedent, so if the Supreme Court's decided an issue, it's well settled, the Court of Appeals decision would usually be let stand. If there's a novel issue, if it's a question that hasn't come up before, if the parties have figured out a novel way to argue an issue that's been seen before, that's more likely to be granted. So that's one category of review. Some Supreme Court cases are in the category of original jurisdiction. And as an example of this, I'd say lawyer disciplinary cases. The lawyer disciplinary system is separate from the process that affects all these other civil and criminal cases that go through the trial court and then the Court of Appeals and then body to the Supreme Court on petition for review. Those cases are just heard in kind of an administrative setting. The disciplinary administrator brings the case against the lawyer who's supposed to have committed an ethical violation. That case is decided. There are findings of fact, there are conclusions of law, and then it goes directly to the Kansas Supreme Court. Doesn't cut through the Court of Appeals, doesn't have any other kind of court review, goes directly to the Supreme Court. It's an original proceeding in discipline. And there are a few types of those cases. You all may have read that the redistricting plan, the maps for certain types of elections were struck down today in Wyandotte County. That has a very special provision that means it won't take a stop beyond the district court and the Court of Appeals. It will go right to the Supreme Court. So there are special cases that sometimes go to the Supreme Court. And that's really the third category. So you have discretionary review, that's all been through 2 levels of courts. You have original jurisdiction, and then you have special categories of cases that are heard in the trial court and then go directly to the Kansas Supreme Court. So that's one type of case that does that. Eminent domain, if you all know that phrase, when land is condemned, when people's real property is condemned, those cases, right to the Kansas Supreme Court. Death penalty cases, right to the Kansas Supreme Court. They don't go through the Court of Appeals. So discretionary review, original jurisdiction, the example being lawyer discipline, and then those special sets of cases that statute or constitutional provisions say go directly to the Kansas Supreme Court. Now, once they're there, that was the next part of the question right there. Okay, so how does it work? What happens? Okay, well, we all watch TV, right? We all watch the movies. And they always have these dramatic, succinct closing arguments, sweaty jurors, right? We know what it looks like on TV. Appellate judging doesn't look anything like that. It's quite a bit less sweat, for starters, which was a relief to me, being a woman of a certain age. So the way that it works for the Supreme Court in Kansas and for most appellate judicial systems is that the parties are often not even in court. So what happens is the lawyers for the parties file briefs. That's their technical name. They're generally not very brief. The page limit, the standing page limit for our court is 50 pages, but frequently not exceeded on motion. So they file these documents that make all of their arguments in writing. They set out the issues that the parties are litigating. The courts do not pick those issues. The issues pick us. So the issues are in the briefs. Parties write out their arguments, lay out the facts that they believe were proved below, and then the court studies the briefs. So there's a period of time after they've been filed where the court, the members of the court and the people who work for them, study the briefs, look up all the cases and statutes and regulations that have been cited in them, and study the issues, and then we go to oral argument. But an oral argument doesn't look anything like on television. It's just two lawyers come to the court, and then they have time limits, and they are able to make arguments. And all the members of the court ask questions, or free to ask questions during argument. When I was in law school, they used to talk a lot about hot courts and cold courts. And many years ago, the Kansas Supreme Court was what was known as a cold court. And what that meant is, as a lawyer, when I was practicing, I could go to the Court of Appeals and start making my argument and be interrupted by a judge and asked a question or what have you. That was a hot court. But if I went to the Kansas Supreme Court, I could make my entire argument uninterrupted and they would just sit and listen. Which, frankly, as an advocate, is unnerving. Because even though the questions can be kind of, in the moment, upsetting and certainly put your adrenaline through the roof, it's better, right, when a judge or justice asks you a question, because then you have some idea what they're thinking. And you have a chance to persuade them or reassure them on something that's bothering them. Well, the court, as I have experienced it, by the time I made it to the Kansas Supreme Court, it was a hot court. I used to call it sizzling, because we would have questions. I think the record for talking at once was 4 justices who all wanted to ask something. So it was a completely different experience. Once oral argument's completed, the court goes back to its conference room and they conference the cases, that's what we call it. That means we have a meeting, which just has a different name. We have a meeting and we talk about the cases. We talk about the issues. Usually one justice has been assigned the job of writing the opinion, but that's a temporary assignment until the discussion has happened and a vote has been taken. And only if that temporarily assigned justice is in the majority does that justice keep the writing assignment. If it turns out that when we get into the conference room and that justice is one of 2 people who don't want to vote that way or whatever is in the minority, then the justices change writing assignments. So that's how it works. It's a long process. It's involved, and it's all designed to fully vet every issue raised by the parties.
Okay, so when you're conferencing and you're writing a brief and there is one person who does not agree with it, they're allowed to write an opinion too. How often does that happen?
I don't have data. I don't have, can you hear me okay? I'll try to talk loud. No, not good.
I don't have numbers. I don't have numbers on this. Somebody asked this question at an earlier event today of a couple of my former colleagues who were speaking, and we don't actually keep data on how many decisions are unanimous on the Kansas Supreme Court versus how many are split in some way. But I would say, I think I agree with them that I think the majority are unanimous. There is some kind of institutional momentum for unanimity. I would say just because if you do decide that you don't agree with the majority ruling, you are going to be writing an extra opinion, right? That's going to be another one on your list that you need to get done. And in fact, the rule of the court generally was if you have a dissent that's owed on someone else's writing, that has to be your first priority. So, I mean, I think the members of the court work hard to get to unanimity if it is possible. And I think the vast majority of cases end up unanimous. And then the other question earlier today was what's the split? Because I think a lot of us, let's face it, we don't read about every single case decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, right? We don't. We read about a handful of controversial ones every year. And what's the vote count all the time?
6-3.
6-3 now, it used to be 5-4, right? right? People get a little cynical about that, I think, with some reason, and we can talk about that later if you'd like. The bottom line is, that's just not predictable on the Kansas Supreme Court. It can be 8-1, it can be 7-2, it can be carved up because the majority has one rationale and the people in dissent have 2 or 3 different ones, so there's 2 or 3 different dissents. It's just a lot more varied and a lot less predictable, and certainly almost never, I can say, total honesty, almost never something that anyone would identify as ideological or political. Kansas Supreme Court justices are not politicians, they're judges.
I don't have time to be writing opinion. Okay, so you hear the oral arguments, you go back to conference. How long does it take to get an opinion written? Is there a deadline? Because that's hard work.
The answer is it really depends. We had some decisions while I was still in the court that were hundreds of pages long. One case. We had some that were 10 pages long, 3 pages long. I mean, it really depends on the complexity and the number of issues raised by the parties. And it depends on how long it takes after the initial writing is done to get everybody to finally commit to their vote and be ready to release the opinion. Because even after someone's drafted the majority, even after maybe there's been a dissent or 2 written and circulated among us, things can change. Because, our goal is always to persuade, right? Not just the public who's ultimately going to read our decision and our explanation for it, but also our colleagues. So that process can take a while.
I would wonder about the time, and I wonder if anybody, maybe this is a good time to take a couple questions, and then I have a couple wrap-up questions. Does anybody want to ask a question?
Do they have, when they make a decision on cases, are they open records, so they are subject to the Kansas Open Records Act, all the discussions?
They're always, we don't publicize the actual conferencing, so that thing I said we call a conference, but it's really just a meeting. That is closed. The deliberations of the court are private and confidential. But once the decision is filed, always public. You can read every decision in the Kansas, you can watch every oral argument in the Kansas Supreme Court if you want. If there's a case you're interested in and you were at work or didn't have time or whatever, you can go watch it online in the archive. They're all available to watch. So the briefs are filed. In almost every case, the briefs are public records that can be accessed. Briefs that the parties write. And then you can watch the oral argument, and then when the decision is filed, the day it's filed, it hits kscourts.org, and you can read every word. Always available.
So I'm curious, do you wish that you were sitting on the court now to hear the redistricting case?
That's gonna be a fast puppy. I understand that when it's filed, and I don't know that there's been a filing yet, but there's a filing that triggers the beginning of consideration. Did it get filed this afternoon? Okay. So your news is more current than mine, 30 days.
Yeah.
That case has to be decided in 30 days. So they're gonna be running pretty fast. Do I wish I was still there? I guess that kind of gets to why you retire. When you retire, all of that. I have served for quite a long time, combined over 20 years on the appellate courts. And I do think it's important in the system to have fresh faces and fresh energy sometimes. And I knew there were very capable people who would apply for my position. And so I was comfortable that it would be well taken care of in my absence. Some of it's just purely personal. My husband had been retired for a long time, and my kids all live very far away, and they're having my grandkids. So I wanted to have more time, more available time to see them. So a lot of it was personal too.
Yeah.
Okay, my name is Sherry Elswenger, so you may know, yes.
Sure, I thought I recognized you.
Yes.
Nice to see you.
You know my son Christopher.
I know Christopher, and he's appeared in front of us hundreds of times, probably.
And so my question has to do with capital punishment,
Uh-huh.
and it has been legal, illegal, unconstitutional, back and forth. Why do you think, I guess I'm asking, why the court has not carried out capital punishment since 1964? Why are the Carr brothers still sitting on death row?
Well, I can't really talk about an individual case like that, especially one that I sat on. So I'm not going to talk about the merits of that particular case, okay? But I will talk about just the general concept. The first concept that I want everybody to understand is the court doesn't sign death warrants. It's not in charge of the ultimate carrying out the punishment, really, in that way. That's not its function. What it does is review, again, a lot of issues raised by the parties about whether a trial was fair. This is actually important for the overall criminal docket, I think, for people to understand. And Chris over the years, he's been in the AG's office for years and Solicitor General's. By the time a case gets to the Kansas Supreme Court, it's usually not about guilt and innocence. At least not on direct appeal, a criminal case. We're not sitting there and re-evaluating what the jury decided, for example, in a criminal case. What we're looking at is process. And in that particular case, but in many others, that process takes a long time because there are not only a series of direct appeals that go through that system I described earlier, but then criminal defendants have the option of doing what's called collateral appeals, and those have not even begun yet in the Carr cases, for example, and they just take many, many years. When a case has dozens of issues in it, the process is flowing. And we're well aware that everybody wishes that in some cases we could move more quickly, but that's just the way it is. Complicated cases take a lot of time. Any other questions about that particular thing? No? Okay, yeah.
You touched on this and maybe going to further. We've expected the judicial system to be nonpartisan and in certain changes. How do we get back to a system that is nonpartisan?
Open up, yeah, I will. The question is about partisanship and the kind of the perception that the judiciary is not as nonpartisan as it once was, or we want to get back to that. And how do we do that? Is that a fair summary? Would you say your question? Okay. First of all, I want to urge you again to go back to what I said about the different judicial systems. And that is that I do think that much of the way things are happening in our federal judiciary has been heavily politicized. I don't disagree with you on that. You know, for many, many years, I tried to keep saying that wasn't true. And I finally had to abandon ship on that and just say, I think things are broken in some respects in terms of the way, for example, nomination and Senate confirmation of U.S. Supreme Court justices are working these days. I think it's discouraging. And as somebody who put 20 years of my life into a nonpartisan judiciary, it's discouraging. Because every time I come out and have these conversations with the public, I get a question of this sort. Because there's a tendency to think that if that's what we're witnessing in the federal system, that's probably what's happening in our system as well. It's not. I can tell you that. There are people who would like it to be. And that's part of the reason I'm out here talking to all of you. It's because I want to urge you to be the board against that in Kansas. Our justices, as I mentioned, are vetted extremely thoroughly by diverse groups of people. If you look at our Supreme Court nominating commission over time, there are Republicans, there are Democrats, there are people who have no interest in politics. They're just people who are interested in getting qualified, experienced people to serve. And those names then go to a governor. Does the governor have a party attachment? Absolutely. But no one asked me what party I was in when I was before Grace, when I was before Sebelius. No one talked about that. I served all those years. Many of my colleagues I served with, there were a couple who retired right before me, I mentioned that. There were a couple behind me who I served many years with. Honestly, if you asked me, I could not tell you for sure what their parties are. It simply is irrelevant to the work. We never talk about it, and it's just not what we do as the state judicial system. Now, there is a partisan aspect to some of our district court elections. I mentioned that half those districts are partisan elections, and obviously their party is a factor, at least in how people get to the bench. Over the years, I can honestly tell you, I simply did not observe whether it was a partisan elected district or an appointment district. I did not observe that people were making decisions on the trial bench according to what party they voted for. They just are trying to do the job to the best of their ability in a nonpartisan, non-political way. So I think so far, we've been pretty successful. But there's been an increasing amount of pressure brought to bear on systems like ours over the last 2 decades, 15 years maybe, where people would like to politicize the judiciary the same way that it's been politicized in the federal system. I think so far we've done a pretty good job of preventing that, but you need to be alert and aware and active and be talking about this with your friends and neighbors so it doesn't happen here. Anything else? Yeah.
Level of resources for the judiciary. The judiciary doesn't have lobbyists who make case for more resources, but particularly I think like at the district court level. The budgets have been cut, the amount of clerks, the amount of recorders, the amount of time. On my staff a committee that Karen Earl chaired several years ago about budget for the judiciary.
Yeah. And the pandemic.
How does that affect the public's access to justice in terms of timely and effective decisions?
Did you hear the question, everybody?
The question was about budget and resources. And there has been a history over the last decades, not maybe a couple decades, 50 years, maybe at least, where fewer and fewer resources have been devoted to the judiciary. And I got a couple responses to this. The first thing I'll say is things are looking up. Finally, the judges went over 10 years without raises, pretty sure. And many, virtually every job category of the state judicial system, every job category, all the non-judicial employees were well below market for their jobs. And obviously, this has several potentials for strength in the system and that access that's so important, right? I mean, you can't have equal justice if you don't have access to justice, right? I mean, we can love equal justice all that we want, and we can profess to deliver it, but if you've got a system that's being strangled for lack of resources, it's pretty hard to make good on it, right? Which is exactly your concern. So this was happening for quite a while. This particular year, and a little bit last year as well, the legislature has started to really come through. As of the beginning of this legislative session, our district judges, our trial bench judges, were 50th in the nation on pay. 50. You know, it used to be, for a long time, Kansas County, it's not like we want to be first, right? We just kind of want to be the Bills, right? But 50th in the nation. And so I'll just give you one example, but this is just one of many. So how do you convince young people to be interested in the bench when talented, experienced people can make 2 and 3 and 4 times the amount of money in the private sector, in private practice? And it got harder and harder. We have had, in the recent past, we have had judicial openings that did not attract a single applicant. Not the Kansas Supreme Court, not the Kansas Court of Appeals, who still want those jobs. I mean, they also were about 43rd or something, 44th. But people in district courts just saying, hey, I have kids to send to college. You know, I have expenses, I support my family, and I can't afford to do this. This is looking up a little bit. This year and last, we have commitments from the legislature to get all of those non-judicial folks to market. And they are slowly they're building back some raises for the judges over the last couple of years. Between COLA and flat raises, I think they're at like 15.25%, which again, on a severely depressed salary is a long way from any kind of parity, but it's helping. This year they've had some success on the improvement. Now, it also helps that this year the state's flush, right? This year, I heard it all the way down today, and we have literally billions of dollars surplus in Kansas general fund, which helps a lot. Right? It's a very good point. And that's another thing I guess I would say to all of you is advocate for that non-politicized judiciary, advocate for resources so that equal access to justice can be done.
So really totally public service.
Yeah.
These jobs are public service and they work for us, but if we don't pay them, so, yeah. So, I mean, that's such an important issue and I'm glad you brought it up. And as was that political, all these questions have been great. And, so I want you to repeat, it's probably about time for us to wrap it up. I want, does anybody else have any questions? I just want you to repeat where we can find information, can read the briefs that have been, or your opinions that have been written, and find out more about the justices.
The best source, the quickest source, is just to go online. It's KS and then COURTS, kansascourts.org. If you go to that website, you can watch oral arguments if you like. You can read opinions. Briefs are a little harder to get hold of if you can. I mean, they're all public. If you want to go up and read a brief, the clerk's office will make sure you have a way to read a brief. There are certain cases for sensitive reasons that are sealed, but they're very rare. So if you want to read briefs, we'd like to, yes. As a person who's read rooms full of them, I don't know that I'll be doing that anytime soon myself, but you can read the briefs, you can read the opinions, you can watch the oral arguments. And that site also has biographies of the justices, so much more full descriptions of who they are, what their experience is. You can read the decisions they write. One of the features of the website for many years was a list, so under my name, you could go and kind of trace what I've written to. So that you can enable that on the site, I think, as well. So that's really useful, and if you care about all this, very educational.
Can I ask you one more question? So this last legislative session, there was proposed a constitutional amendment about changing the way the justice is. What are your thoughts on that? If it's not broke, don't fix it?
Yeah, that sums it up well. There were two proposals. One was for straight up partisan elections of our Kansas Supreme Court. And it would take a constitutional amendment. Remember at the beginning I said that this creature is constitutional. Okay, so in order to change the selection method, you needed an amendment. And one amendment was, the suggestion was to just have partisan elections like we do here in Central County for trial bench and several other judicial districts. The other amendment was to go to that federal model like I described for the Court of Appeals, where the governor would just appoint with or without whatever vetting the governor chose to have, and then Senate confirmation, but still light, where there would be retention elections, so no life terms. I don't have any problem saying I'm against both of them, and I'm happy they were defeated. I think that the system we have now helps to limit creeping politicization of our judiciary. And I think that's vital. I mean, the court is supposed to be the one place where politics don't matter. And if we want to make good on that, if we want to live up to it, then I think it's important to depoliticize the selection process as well.
Yeah.
I have one kind of comment or question, and that is, in conjunction with the cost of the judiciary, some of that isn't it because the legislature is so glib about making new laws, but they don't back it with any more money for the judicial system, which now has to help enforce those or adjudicate those laws.
I don't know, that's an interesting theory.
That came from my two sons that are attorneys. That's why I asked it, because they complained about that.
I should mention one more thing. There is, I guess there is a tendency to try and fix things with legislation. I mean, There's an old, I think this was a Little House on the Prairie books that I read with my daughter when she was little, you know, about, and the only things are her death and taxes, and no man is safe when the legislature's in session and all that. Those kind of old saws, right, that we've all heard. I guess I do want to mention one other thing, though. Your question reminds me of this, and it goes to your question on resources. A very significant change this year in funding mechanism is that these courts were fee funded, by and large fee funded, which is it's bad news for a lot of people. It's bad news for court users, right? Every time you show up, you had to pay a fee, right, to file a case. You would file a motion. A few years ago, if you wanted to file a motion for summary judgment in a civil case, which is a great thing to do because it limits the litigation and can dispose of it early in the process rather than going clear through trial and appeal in many years and many dollars for everyone. So that, I mean, there were these fees kind of getting piled on top of fees, and that was the funding mechanism for the courts. Well, it always had infirmity, it always had volatility that was really kind of unacceptable as a foundation for a large organization with many people who needed to be employed and receive benefits, et cetera. Well, this year, that changed. And now court fees are going into the general fund, and the general fund, there'll be an allocation for the court on July 1 that they know they can count on. And it's a really positive development that should help them enforce those new laws.
I would add, though, there is a tendency on the part of the legislature to treat the judiciary as a special interest rather than a co-equal branch of government. So when the Chief Justice is not always invited to come to address the legislature, which has traditionally been an important part of dealing with that balance of power structure.
My sense of things is that the relationship between the branches is less frosty than it once was. And again, y'all heard me say how fabulous she was. Our former chief was fabulous too, but I think Marla's been doing a great job, but she's helping to cement some of those relationships.
It's encouraging.
Incidentally, the chief of our Court of Appeals, who's mentioned over here, is also a woman. FYI.
There are 7 now, 7 and 7 on Court of Appeals, 7 women, 7 men. Never had it.
Okay, I want to thank you so much for your time. This has been so educational, and I want you to feel free to ask Carol anything or address, if someone here wants to tell one of your friends to go and hear more about this issue, where can they go? KansasCourts.org. KansasCourts.org. And there will be other
forums.
Yes, other forums. That's what I was trying to say. Okay, perfect. I just want you to be able to spread the word.
Thank you all for coming out and joining us. I know I learned a lot, and I heard a lot of yeses from those of you around me, and it's all I had notes. So thank you for taking the time to share with us. And yes, please continue to advocate. And if nothing else, we learned how important it is to pay attention to all levels of what's going on, and really push back against that partisanship, which most of us attendants are members of the League of Women Voters, and that's a huge passion of ours. So thank you again for your time and for just being willing to take our questions this morning. So thank you very much.